Howdy folks, Spencer here, and today I'll be showing you how to set up a meta phaser DPS build on the Typhoon Temporal Battlecruiser. As always, chapters to each topic are listed down below. With this build guide, I will be showing you how to build out the Typhoon Temporal Battlecruiser for Beam Overload, Fire at Will, Cannon Rapid Fire, and Cannon Scattervolley. The builds that I'm going to be showing you are optimized for traditional gameplay like random elites, where you may not have a dedicated tank in there, where you may need to bring in some control of your own, things like that. And this video format that I'm going to be trying out today is an experiment, but I feel that given the four builds are very similar, that I am going to be able to break them down in a way that should be easy for you guys to follow. But I would appreciate it if you can let me know what you guys think of this format in the comment section after you have finished the video. And a quick note that I'm adding in post here, but I just want to clarify that each of the builds I'm showing in this video are designed to take advantage of the current console spamming meta, which is done by spamming the unconventional systems trait and utilizing the console off of the Voven Obelisk carrier, which is the recent summer event ship. By taking advantage of that combo, you're able to have extremely high uptime on your console clicky abilities, which is boosting your performance to levels that are just quite crazy. So if you're not a fan of Uncon and you just absolutely can't stand it, you're probably not going to like these builds. First up, let's go over power levels. Set yourself to the weapons preset in the power window, which is the very first option. The weapons power is going to directly boost how much damage your beams and cannons are doing. So if you're ever on an energy weapon based build, you should always have your weapons power maxed out. And if you're on PC, you can further customize your power settings by adjusting where the rest of the power goes. So you're going to want to split that between engines and auxiliary. Engines is going to buff the speed of your ship, and the auxiliary is going to help out any science stuff you have, but it's also going to help the Fleet Power Network Array console off of the C-Store Wani. That console gives a massive amount of weapons haste, and it scales with your auxiliary power settings. Now, as I'll be showing later in the video, you should be using the large aux batteries before hitting the Fleet Power console. So make sure you have at least 25 to 30 aux just sitting there so that when you use those aux batteries, you're getting the max auxiliary power level you can get. And again, if you're on PC, you can customize your power settings by going to the little power window here and hitting the button at the top right and going to 3. And then from there, you can lock your weapons at max and you can drag around the power bars to customize your power settings. And next up is the ship gear. So I'll be hopping in game to go over the deflector, engine core, and shields, the devices, and the consoles. The items are pretty much the same between each of the builds I'll be showing off. There's only a single console that may differ between the different builds, and I'll talk about that here momentarily. And I'll be talking about weapons separately in another slide here in a few minutes. So first up, we have the deflector, engine core, and shield. For the deflector, I am running the Elite Fleet Intervention Protomatter Deflector from the Fleet Colony. So this gives you up to 4% crit chance and 15% severity based on your current hull capacity. And I have this one rerolled for Control X and EPG. You can reroll it to whatever modifiers you want. For the engines, I have the competitive reputation prevailing innervated impulse engines. So whenever I hit a firing mode, these are going to be giving me basically an evasive maneuvers. You don't have to use this specific variant. For most of the builds here, there's only going to be 1 or 2 abilities that are going to actually trigger that. So if you wanted to use the bolstered version that goes off of control abilities, there would actually be twice as many abilities on this build that would work with that than the innervated one. So you do have options there. And if you absolutely just hate the competitive rep engines, you could put the disco engines on for the 2-piece with the shield if you want that survivability buff. So that's entirely up to you. For the warp core, I am using the Tholian nucleating warp core. This is going to generate Tholian warp crystals whenever you defeat a foe. If an enemy flies into those warp crystals, it is going to damage them. And if you or an ally fly into them, it's going to give you some secondary shielding. So it's a pretty nice core to have on. It's not currently available if you miss that event. Hopefully that's something they add into the MUD store sooner rather than later. If you don't have it, you could run the disco core here and just do that for the 2-piece with the shield. Alternatively, if you have one of the older fleet spire cores, like the plasma integrated, that'd be perfectly fine here. So run whatever you have. And then for the shield, I just have the Tilly shield from the Disco rep. This is going to give you increased damage versus enemy shields from your weapon attacks. So it's a pretty good shield to have on, even with lower shield power. And heading over to devices, I have a deuterium surplus on for the speed boost that provides, an advanced battery energy amplifier for the damage buff. I then have a large Oxbat. You want to hit that before hitting that Fleet Power Network Array console to get as much haste from it as you can. Then I have the Kobayashi Maru transponder for the little buffs that pops out, and the Temporal Negotiator from the Delta Recruitment event. And I'll go over DOFs here more in a couple of minutes, but along with those devices, I am running a Battery Quartermaster DOF. This gives you a bit of cooldown reduction for your batteries. So if I hit a large Oxbat here, you can see that the cooldown for it is 30 seconds if I want to hit another large Oxbat, or 15 seconds there for that advanced energy amplifier. Now, if I take this duty officer off, you'll see those cooldowns are quite a bit longer. So this is an older DOF that doesn't get much attention, but if you're looking to spam devices, especially these batteries like the large Ox one, that is a very good duty officer to have on hand. And in addition, I was also using the plus 10 skill boost items from the Fleet Starbase. If you're just a casual player, don't worry about these, but this is plus 10 to engineering, science, and tax skills for 4 hours once active. And I was also using the prototype ablative Jevonite hardpoint devices. You can get these from DOF missions, the exchange, and some DOF packs. This is plus 100 Starship hull capacity for 15 minutes. Pretty handy, and the buff from that is pretty significant. So before having it on, I was at 132,607 HP, and with one active, I am at 151.5k. So if you want a bit more hull capacity to boost up your survivability, then those devices may be worth looking at. You don't have to have them slotted. They can be right in your inventory and work. So definitely something you may want to take a look at. And heading over to the consoles, I am running 6 of the Phaser isomags. So with these, make sure you're getting the one that has fully spelled out the word phaser in the modifier bracket at the end. And I have seen some recent comments about some people being confused because they say plasma in the name. Every isomag console has that. That is just the name of the console. What you care about is the modifier at the end. And again, for a phaser setup, you want it to say phaser. And heading over to the rest of the consoles, we have the Agony Redistributor in the first Science console slot. This is still a very good console to use. They did nerf it, but then they buffed it back up a couple years ago. If you put this on a big target that you and your teammates are hitting, it's going to take damage that you guys do to that target and deal additional damage to nearby foes. Very powerful when used right. Then there is the Fleet Power Network Array console off of the Owani. Again, this is a console that every single energy weapon build should be using. It gives a massive amount of firing cycle haste so that your weapons fire much faster. I then have the Subspace Fracture Tunneling Field console from the Vovan Obelisk, the most recent summer ship. This console is insanely overpowered for its cooldown reduction for universal consoles. If you do not have that Vovan Obelisk from the summer event, it is worth picking up with Lobby. So if you have your event campaign Lobby and you did not participate in the summer event, that should be priority number 1 because this console is that powerful. TAC console wise, I've got the Adaptive Emergency Systems console on. This is from a variety of the older engineering flagship variants, and the legendary flagship variants also have it. Pretty good console for the damage buff. Then, of course, I have the DPRM. I have the Immolating Phaser Lance for the UD proc it is and for the phaser damage it does. And for the last console, that's the one that can change a bit depending on the build. For the Fire at Will and Cannon Scatter Volley setups, if you're looking for survivability, I would take a look at the Valdor Shield Absorptive Frequency Generator console. This is a massive amount of shield healing, very, very powerful with an AoE setup. But with Beam Overload and Rapid Fire, it does become a bit lackluster. You could also consider for survivability the Cyclone's Sensor Phantom Projector. That's pretty good. If you want more damage, then you could do Domino or the Experimental Power Redirection from the Excelsior 2. Either of those would work fine. You could also do whatever else you want there. Those are just some recommendations, but in general, with the current meta, you want to have a lot of clicky consoles, and that is why I've optimized for most of these non-isomag consoles to be clickies to get the most out of those console slots. And next up is the weapons. So for the modifiers, I was using crit D damage for the epic mod and then damage times 4. If you have crit D times 4, that's perfectly fine also. For the specific phaser variants, you can use whatever you like. The difference between the worst and the best phaser variant is like a fraction of a percent right now. So just use whatever looks and sounds the best to you. For the cannon setups, so cannon scatter volley and rapid fire, I used the Terran Rep DHC, and then I had 4 of the sensor linked dual heavy cannons on. If you want to use another variant, like I said, go for it. And aft, I had the Pavin Set Omni and 2 sensor linked turrets. So the Pavin Omni, I know it's not phaser, it does proton damage, but the proc on it does a ton of damage, and it is worth running on any of these builds. So if you don't have the Pavin Omni, it is still available to buy out. Just go to the event window, and that is the Pavo event that happened earlier this year. It is worth the 25 bucks. That is the best set Omni in the game. You don't even have to have the console or Torp on with it. Just have it on by itself, and it will do very, very well. For the beam setup for beam overload and fire at will with redirecting arrays, I had the Disco Rep dual beam bank and then 4 sensor linked dual beam banks. Aft was the Pavin Set Omni, a non-set, in this case, sensor linked Omni, and then I had the Omega Reputation kinetic cutting beam. In an ideal world, I'd love to be able to just put a third Omni on, but right now we are limited in that regard. And for the ETM setup for FAW, it's pretty much the same thing, just drop one of the dual beam banks for the Disco Rep Dark Matter Quantum Torpedo. And a couple of quick notes regarding the weapons. Again, any phaser variant is fine. I use the sensor linked because each one that you have slotted provides you plus 2% crit D for any weapons on your build. So with enough of them on, that starts to stack up. And the Pavin Omni, like I said, is really good. It will beat any phaser set Omni, and it isn't even a close competition. If you want to do arrays instead of dual beam banks, you can drop the kinetic cutting beam for another array. And as for why I don't have a torpedo on the majority of the builds, with how much weapon haste we have nowadays, most of the torpedoes out there really have a hard time competing against another weapon. Even for the Dark Matter Quantum, when I used that on a fire at will setup, it was doing about half of what a dual beam bank was. So really not that great with how the weapon haste meta is. You can do that if you really want, but I wouldn't recommend it. You can also use a Maelstrom if you want something that does a bit better, but with this ship, you don't have the room to do a Torp Spread 3 plus a high rank firing mode for your energy weapons. So I just opted to just run pure energy weapons for this build. And before I move on to the next part of the build guide, I do want to just address that this build guide, while it's titled Phaser, does not just apply to Phaser. You could easily swap this over to any other weapon flavor just by swapping the weapons out and the isomag consoles. Everything else on the build is going to work for any weapon flavor, whether it be Disruptor, Tetron, Anti-Proton, whatever. You literally just have to swap the isomags and the weapons out, and you're good to go. And heading over to the bridge officer setup, the first page here is going over the part of the setup that is basically the same for each of the builds. So for the Ensign Universal, I have that set as an engineer with emergency powered engines 1. That is a good speed boost, and if you're using the emergency con hologram, which you can get from the Phoenix store, then that is going to reset your evasive maneuvers whenever you hit emergency powered engines. For the Commander Engineer with Temporal, I have Heisenberg Amplifier, a temporal ability which is also an uncon proc. Chronometric Inversion Field in the second slot, that is also an uncon proc. Then I have Emergency Powered Weapons 3, Timeline Collapse 3, which is also an uncon. If you're doing the Beam Overload or Cannon Rapid Fire setups, you may also want to consider Recursive Shearing instead. That will give you some extra damage on bigger targets. For the Lieutenant Commander Psi, Tractor Beam 1, another uncon. Very Cold in Space, that is going to do a little bit of damage. Alternatively, you could also do Photonic Officer for some cooldown reduction if you wanted. Then I have a Gravity Well 1, which is a really good control ability and also an uncon. Then for the Lieutenant Universal, I have that set to Science with Jam Targeting Sensors 1 and Scramble Sensors 1, both of which are uncons. So that gives you a total of 7 uncons for the CSV and FAW setups. And if you're on a beam overload or rapid fire setup and you swap the timeline collapse to recursive shearing, then that will drop you down to just 6 uncons. And if I didn't mention it already, all of the bridge officers are either watchers or superior running than operative. Watchers are going to provide you with a larger crit chance buff. The SROs are going to give you a lower crit chance buff, but you get more crit severity. So if you're on the lower crit chance side of things, definitely pick up some Watcher Bridge Officers. You can run them in every slot. Each of them provides 3% crit chance and severity, which is a very good buff. So for the beam fire wheel setup for the Lieutenant Commander attack, I would do Torpedo Spread 1. This is going to be either a Comp Engine proc or an ATM proc. Then you have Attack Pattern Beta 1. The debuff from that is really, really good. And then, of course, Fire at Will 3. For the beam overload setup, Distributed Targeting 1 or a Torp Firing Mode for another Comp Engine proc. If you do Distributed Targeting, that is just going to spread some of your single target damage out to nearby foes. So use whichever feels better to you. And then, of course, Attack Pattern Beta 1 and Beam Overload 3. For the rapid fire setup, I have Beam Overload 1 on for a Comp Engine proc, then Attack Pattern Beta 1 and Cannon Rapid Fire 2. And for the CSV setup, I have Beam Overload 1, again for Comp Engines, then Attack Pattern Beta 1 and CSV 2. And heading into the traits, let's start off with the personal space traits here. So a good day to die because I am on attack captain. If you're not on attack, you could do something like duelist fervor instead. Then I have adaptive offense for the crit chance and severity that provides. Scrolling down, duelist fervor, like I mentioned, if you're not attack, that may be good to pick up. Then I have fleet coordinator. If you're in a team environment, this is going to give you a larger damage buff. Then I have Fragment of AI Tech. This gives you some control expertise, which is going to help boost up your Gravwell and Timeline Collapse if you're running that. And it's also going to give you some Cat 1 energy weapon damage based on what your Control X skill is at. Going down, I have Intel Handler on. This is 4% crit chance from you or a teammate defeating the marked foe. Pretty good to have on for the crit chance there. Then I have Intelligence Agent Attaché for the Captain ability recharge. Scrolling down here. If you're on a cannon setup, you may want to take a look at Superior Cannon Training. If you're on a beam setup, Symbiotic Ice is a trait that is often slept on. That's a pretty good trait for beam builds, beam arrays, or dual beam banks. This is going to give you an additional 6% of beam damage as additional cold damage. So pretty good trait to have on. Terran targeting is good for anything. The Boimler effect for the cooldown reduction, of course. Unconventional systems is pretty core to this entire build along with the Evolving console. This is going to give you cooldown reduction for all of your universal console click keys every time you hit a control ability. And again, going back to the PowerPoint, there's quite a few uncons on this build. So, 6 to 7 uncons. That trait is going to help you quite substantially. And for survivability, you may also want to consider a whole lot of X's. This is another trait that is still a bit cheaper on the market. And what this trait does is when you're below 25% hull capacity, it's going to give you a heal and some shield regen. It can only happen once every 2 minutes, but that can help keep you alive in a random TFO situation. And for the Starship traits, I have Emergency Weapon Cycle on for the minus weapon power cost and the firing cycle haste that provides when you hit emergency power to weapons. I then have Ship of the Line from the Legendary Avenger. So this is going to provide you up to 50% crit severity. And all you have to do to keep the buff from it up is just alternate hitting emergency power to subsystem abilities. So just chaining weapons and engines back to back is all you need to do to maintain 4 stacks of this in combat. And then we have Temporal Tunneling from the Atlantis. So when you hit exotic or temporal operative bridge officer abilities, this is going to give you 100% firing cycle haste for 5 seconds, and it can go off every 15. So when you average that out to a third uptime, that is 33% firing cycle haste, pretty good. Then I have Terran Goodbye, which is going to give me up to 75 accuracy and 15% crit chance. And all you have to do to keep those stacks up is just defeat a couple foes, so pretty good. And then the last trait that is on each of the builds here is Universal Designs, of course. When you hit Universal Consoles, you're going to get 2% crit chance and 10% severity per stack, with a max of 5 stacks, meaning you can get up to 10% crit chance and 50% severity out of that trait. And for the final two traits, one of them must be your firing mode extender for whatever firing mode you've decided to go with. So for your fire at will setups, you're going to want to have either entwined tactical matrices or redirecting arrays on. Both of those traits sort of suck to use, which is why fire at will is not very popular right now. And then for beam overload, you want to have super weapon ingenuity on. For cannon rapid fire, that'd be go for the kill. And for cannon scatter volley, withering barrage. And alongside that, then you'd want to have another trait on that is giving you a damage or haste buff. One that I really like is the Ruin of our enemies, but the issue with Ruin is it's only really good on AoE based builds. You need to be getting a lot of kills for that trait to really be worth running. And if you're on a single target setup with rapid fire or beam overload, you're just not going to get as much out of that trait as a CSV or FAW setup would. So you may want to consider then Calm Before the Storm, which is a very accessible trait that's off of the Sea Store Gamora, I believe, a Cardassian ship. And what this trait does is you build up stacks, and once you have 10 stacks, for 20 seconds, you're going to get a haste buff and some bridge officer ability cooldown reduction. So it's not as good as Ruin, but for the cost, it's pretty decent. And for the cannon rapid fire setup, you could also consider something like Thirst for Battle, which is from the legendary Bortisque. This is going to give you some maneuverability, and it's also 40% cat 1. And it says it has a cooldown, but in practice it does not actually have a cooldown. And heading over to the duty officers, on the active ground slots, I have the Elder Malikitan duty officer from the Gamma recruitment event. That is plus 10% cap 1, and that does affect space when slotted on ground. Same for the Neil Falconer duty officer. This one is going to give you some extra damage versus Borg, even if you have it slotted on ground. So that's another 5% cap 1 there. And heading over to space, I have an energy weapon, crit severity, and crit chance duty officer on. The very rare ones are always really expensive. They do decrease in price during promotional pack events, but it's been a while since the last one, so they are really expensive right now. The rares have a pretty good chance to proc as well. Those are 3% instead of the very rares, which are at 4%. So you can get the rares and save yourself some money if you want. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, the emergency con hologram from the Phoenix store is really good because when you use emergency powered engines, it will reset the cooldown on evasive maneuvers. Getting from point A to point B is very important for DPS performance. You want to minimize your lost time between enemies if you can. And I also mentioned the battery quartermaster earlier. This says 100% cooldown rate, but it's not actually 100%. It is going to cut the cooldown time in half though for your batteries. So I showed this earlier. You just have it on and it will cut that time in half. Very handy if you need to spam a lot of Oxbats or really any batteries, so pretty good to have. And for the last two duty officer slots, if you're on a CSV or rapid fire setup, Vincent Kish is there. It has a chance to increase your rank 2 up to rank 3. I really don't think this stuff goes off enough to really be worth slotting, so I'm just going to pass over it, but it is there. It is pretty cheap to get on the exchange if you want to play around with it. Alternatively, if you're on a fire at will setup, you could try the Dal Rel duty officer to try and get fire at will when you hit attack pattern beta. In reality, this thing does not go off often, so don't expect much from it. So the main duty officers that I'd probably be taking a look at are going to be some of the security officers, specifically the Borg ones, but as many of you know, these things can get pretty expensive. So looking at the build here, we have a total of 2 engineer abilities on pretty much all the setups, 3 temporal abilities, 5 science abilities, and then there is 3 tac. So in order of what's going to proc the most, it's going to be science, then tac and temporal, and engineering is going to be last. And there is a command seat on here, but none of the builds I have are taking advantage of that because for a do setup, just don't have room to. So looking at the options here, when it comes to the science org doffs, you've got 32. That's going to be a 15% chance when you hit science abilities to give you a 20% crit severity buff. That would probably be a good option for the setup, but this is a relatively expensive Borgdorf. It's not the most expensive, but these do tend to sit around 2 to 300 million. But that would be a good option with how this build is set up. Then we have 29. That is another science one that you may want to go for. That is going to be a bit cheaper. When you hit any of these science abilities, it's a 15% chance to set your power to max for 5 seconds. So that might be pretty appealing. And again, that is one that is a bit more accessible to obtain. Heading over to the TAC ones, 27, of course, that's going to be a 15% chance when you hit TAC abilities to get that 20% crit severity. But if you have 32 on, they're not going to stack. It's just going to be more chances to proc that and get that 20% crit severity. And then let's see here, 24, of course, for the max power for 5 seconds when you hit TAC abilities. That's always good. And after that, I guess 26 would also be good because that's going to be a 30% chance when you hit temporal abilities to get 2.5% crit chance. But after that, I don't think any of these are really going to be that crazy. 21, when you hit temporal abilities, 30% chance to get 50 weapon armor pen. That's something, but it's not really that much here, so I probably wouldn't worry about that one. So yeah, I think the ones that I'd really focus on are 24, 26, 27, 29, or 32. Any of those two would be fine. 29 is going to be one of the cheaper ones. Unfortunately, 24, 26, and 27 are like the most expensive for a good reason. They're really good DOFs. 26, 24, they're really popular for a variety of builds, and a 27, of course, is almost as expensive as a lockbox ship. So I can show you guys how much these things go off, and I can show you 24 in action here. This is the one that's going to give you a potential max power buff. So yeah, having that go off from either 24 or 29, that's a pretty nice buff, and you get the power instantly, but when it goes away, you see it factors in your EPS, and it does take time to go away. So it's instantly there, but when it's done, it does persist a bit longer. So definitely consider a 24 or 29 on this build, and then after that, whatever your budget can afford. Next up is the skill tree. So this is closely following what I did with the skill tree recommendation video I did earlier this year. So I'll have that link down below if you want to check it out. But just make sure you are choosing battery expertise at the engineering 5-point option here. That is going to double the duration of how long your batteries are up. So very important you have that for this build. For the specializations, I am running Intel Primary for the flanking bonus in Tier 3, and of course for Intel Fleet itself. And for the secondary, I'd recommend Strategist for these builds, for the crit severity that you get from that, the survivability, and that nice placate clicky, which also gives you a damage buff. So definitely go for Intel Strat here. And for my tray setup, tray 10 is my primary spam bar. Abilities are activated from left to right. For me, I have this as my F key, but for most of you, this would be your space bar. And up first here, you can see I have my primary firing mode. So for my CSV setup, the CSV is up front. Whichever firing mode you do, make sure that your firing mode is the very first ability on the spam bar. That will help reduce some of the misfires that you may see. For tray 9, that is my secondary spam bar where I put some of my larger buffs like Attack Parent Alpha, Go Down Fighting, my Immolating Phase Lance, stuff like that. And I do have that bound to the G key. Put that as whatever you feel works best for you. And then everything else here is just manually activated. And here are my control settings for those interested. I do have the only attack if target selected and select auto target on attack set to off. These enable me to use the Vovin console on myself without teleporting to a foe. So as you're going to see in some of the combat footage here in a moment, I am able to use that console without actually teleporting to a foe, and it is because I have these settings and I deselect and have no foe targeted when I hit the console. And now it's time for some run footage. So I'm going to show you guys the CSV, CRF, beam overload, and FAW footage that I have, and I'll have the firing mode listed up on screen. Chapters to each one are down below if you want to skip ahead. And after I show the combat, I'll go through and do some commentary looking at the parse from each of the runs.
the nanite crystal. Gun. Additional DECS available. The nanite probe to repair the transmitter. Stop them. Probe is closing in on the transmitter. Destroy it.
Okay, and here's the parse from that 1707 CSV infected run that I did. So in this run, I was still using the wide arc phase cannons. I ended up dropping them because in most runs I found that they just were lacking just a smidge behind my other DHCs. But they did pretty good in this run, 158k, whereas the other three DHCs there did 439 combined. So good performance there from them. Resonance Shock did 227k. That is the proc off of the POV and Omni. So on AoE based builds especially, that POV and Omni is just absolutely insane for the amount of damage it can do. The Borg Cube listing here is from me hitting the Agony Redistributor console on that at the start. So me hitting that at the start there got me 106.6k DPS. The Tholian Warp Crystals from the Tholian Nucleating Warp Core got me another 73k there, plus another 13k down below. That's a really good Warp Core on these AoE based builds. Emulating Phase Lance, 63.7. I had a teammate that hit Lithium Laced Weaponry on me from the Credence, so that was another 39k. The Agony at the Gateway was 26, so I mean, I think it's a pretty good showing there for the CSV setup. Now let's take a look at some of the others.
Scanning the nanite crystal. Gun. Additional DECS available. The nanite probe to repair the transmitter. Stop them.
Okay, and for this 1363 FAW run, it was pretty decent, but one of the things that I saw looking at the VOD and looking at the parse is that the loadout system, being such a wonderful system, did bug out on me, and it did take ETM back off the build, and it looks like it put redirecting arrays back on. So there's not really any point for me to have had the Torp on in this run, which you can see far underperformed another dual beam bank. So that is just the wonders of the STO loadout system. But still, it was a pretty decent run. And on this run, I did have temporal secondary active. For most of my DPS stuff, I tend to run temporal secondary, but I still would recommend for most of you to go with strategist secondary for this specific set of builds. Generally, the temporal stuff is just better for the psi and plasma stuff that I tend to do. So the parse here, nothing, really crazy. Symbiotic Ice, we can see, did about 18k DPS. The Agony still did pretty well against the starting group, 130.6k. Against the Gateway, 76k. So pretty good results out of the Agony there. The Immolating Phase Lance did well. The Tholian Core, 61.7k there. And sometimes it splits up into a few different lines. I don't see anything else. So still pretty good results from everything, and especially with this not having the correct trait on, a pretty impressive number for FAW.
You have entered an... Looks like our fight got them to notice us. Let's go over and ask if their FAWs might come out of hiding. Keep concentrating fire on individual ships. Separate them and whittle down their numbers.
We will not go quietly.
Stand down and surrender to the Benton Guard. Sensors are picking up small habitations in some of the asteroids, possibly consistent with multiple temporary hideouts.
We do what we want, where we want.
Picked up a tight beam transmission on a new frequency. We're jamming that spectrum of their comms now, but it was probably a call for assistance.
I'm taking you with me.
That's got them. Excellent work.
And here's the parse from the Cannon Rapid Fire Argala that I did. Honestly, this went a bit smoother than I expected. It's been a while since I've used Rapid Fire, but it's generally felt a bit weak in the past couple of years, but I think this is pretty good results here. That was a pretty fast Argala, and when I was shooting a target, it all died pretty fast, so pretty good results all around. And here is the beam overload Japori that I did. So pretty good results here also. That was pretty fast, just over a minute. And something you may have noticed with both the CRF and this overload parse is that Resonance Shock and the Tholian Core both did a bit weaker here. In patrols, they're always going to be a little bit weaker, but in general, with single target builds, you're not able to take advantage of those things as much as an AoE build would. You can still get good results out of them, but certainly nothing like what you saw with the FAW and CSV setups. But still, this was a fun build to fly around with, and I'm not usually the biggest Beam Overload fan, but it was doing pretty well on this ship. Overall, I feel like each of the builds that I tried on this ship all worked very effectively in the content I tried them in. I do think Fire at Will would probably be the weakest, just due to the limitations of Fire at Will itself in the current state of the game. Hopefully that's something we see addressed at some point, but regardless, I think each build here clearly was very functional, and the Typhoon Temporal Battlecruiser, especially for a free event ship, is certainly a very capable platform, very versatile. You can effectively do any cannon or beam based build on it. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think about this. Were there any builds here that stood out to you? Let me know down below. And that's going to be it for today. Again, if you have any feedback on this format, please let me know down below. And of course, thank you to all channel members and viewers for the continued support. See you guys around.